Hello and welcome to my presentation about the early 20th century's fisheries in Indonesia, or the Dutch East Indies as it was known during my time period. This presentation will mostly focus on Indonesia's largest island, Java, in its capital city, Semarang. This slide shows a map of Semarang as it was in 1910, a major port for the Dutch Empire. In terms of the fish trade, local fisherfolk referred to their target catch as layang. However, this was actually a range of species, including the Decapterus cura, Decapterus russelli, and Decapterus macrosoma. Most of the fish that were sold in the early 20th century from Java were salted, but there was beginning to be a shift to refrigeration technology. Throughout Indonesia, there was also a trade in shark meat, fish, teeth, and oil. There is evidence through Dutch civil service records that the shark trade existed in Indonesia from the early 19th century. It was encouraged by Dutch authorities from the 1930s as a method of making waters safer for fishermen and to introduce another lucrative trade. This was done, however, without any knowledge of shark migration, so it is unclear how useful this effort was at the time. My chosen primary source is a photograph taken circa 1900. It is labelled as Primitive Contrivances for Onshore Fishing. I will show it again once I come to analyse the source. So what does the image show? My chosen primary source is being preserved by the National Museum van Wereldculturen, or the Museum of World Culture, based in Amsterdam, and is part of the online database for the Research Museum of Material Culture. This is likely because at the time this source was produced, Indonesia was under Dutch rule. The museum's purpose is to conduct research into different primary sources from various collections acquired globally through colonialism, with the aim to allow repatriation of items to their original countries, should this be requested. This picture is among many at the museum which document East Asian fishing and everyday life during the Dutch colonial era. It is not stated outright who the creator of this source was, but during the early 20th century there were many research expeditions carried out by the Europeans in order to learn about indigenous fishing methods. They also made many efforts in Java to persuade local fisherfolk to use modern Western technology when it came to fishing, such as the use of motors and trawlers. Locals were open to use this technology once Europeans could prove that it was beneficial to use it. Some fisherfolk added small motors to their ships, but they did not fully industrialize their fishing methods to a Western extent due to these efforts. By the late 19th century and early 20th century, colonial powers were waking up to the fact that the oceans were a key resource which had more potential. As crops were failing in India, there were beginning to be advancements in refrigeration technology, the possibilities of an international fish trade was becoming more realistic. In particular, Java's fisheries were struggling from overfishing and low prices due to global competition. Java's fish imports had risen by 5,000 tons in a decade and were popular as they were cheaper than domestically caught fish. This resulted in many fishermen looking for other employment. In addition, globally, there were efforts by colonial powers to transfer fish into other territories. Beginning from the 1890s to the 1940s, over 30 species were transplanted within Southeast Asia, and only some of them originated within the region. The giant gourami from Java became a staple fish in transfers and is shown on this slide. So how would I analyse the source? This source is significant because it shows the local fishing method of using lift nets or payang nets from within the harbour. In the background there are European-style fishing boats. Local boats were featured on the previous slide. This shows that it was important for the Dutch to document and research local fishing methods despite their later efforts to convert them. It can be inferred from this source that despite the technology being available in Java around 1900, local fisherfolk were not interested or converting to it until the Dutch colonial authorities began to actively seek development in the fishing industry. It is also worth noting that while it was clearly possible to fish, the boats are still docked. Before the mid-19th century, fisherfolk had preferred offshore fishing. However, after the development of inshore fish ponds and coastal overfishing, onshore fishing became more popular by the end of the 19th century. It could also be because the boats had made enough profit to not still be out on the water. However, it is unclear exactly when this photo was taken. The source is labelled as Primitive Contrivances for Inshore Fishing. This description demonstrates the efforts by colonial powers to impose a Western dominant knowledge system by framing indigenous techniques as old or outdated and European methods as efficient and modern. In his book, Liquid Empire, Ross states that many colonial contributions to fishing were guesswork. Despite their lack of knowledge, they were often disinclined to listen to local fisherfolk about matters such as overfishing and transferring. So how would I relate this to my essay topic? My essay is going to be about fisheries in Indonesia in the early 1900s. My primary source is in the early part of this time frame, and it shows methods of fishing before colonial intervention in the industry became more prominent. Because of this, it ties into the theme of dominant knowledge systems as colonial powers attempted to push Western science and technology onto local fisherfolk, often resulting in damage to marine ecosystems. So here's my last slide, which is the bibliography of my primary and secondary sources. My chosen primary source is in bold. Thank you for listening.